Hello everyone, and welcome to Dark Whispers. I know many of you listen to these stories to help you fall asleep, and before you drift off, I would love to hear from you. Please leave a comment and let me know where you're listening from around the world. And if you're enjoying the video, don't forget to like and subscribe. Story 1. I woke up suddenly, my eyes opening to an unfamiliar ceiling above me. For a moment, I thought I was still dreaming. I felt confused and disoriented. The warmth of the room felt strange, and the scent of fresh linens in the air didn't smell like any place I knew. Slowly, I turned my head, expecting to see the familiar surroundings of my own bedroom. But instead, I saw a room I didn't recognize. The walls were a dull shade of beige, and the furniture was sparse. It was nothing like what I was used to. I sat up in bed, trying to gather my bearings. My heart began to race as panic started to take over. Where was I? How had I gotten here? I didn't remember leaving my home, let alone being brought to this strange place. The sheets were soft, too soft, and the pillow under my head felt unfamiliar. Not the one I usually used. I ran my fingers through my hair, trying to make sense of what was happening, but my mind was blank. I swung my legs over the side of the bed and stood up shakily, feeling weak and disoriented. The room around me was quiet, too quiet, with only the faint sound of distant traffic coming from outside. The light coming through the window was bright, but muted, as though it was early in the morning. I took a step forward, glancing around the room, trying to find something that could help me understand where I was. That's when I noticed the bag in the corner of the room. It was a simple duffel bag, nothing special. But what caught my attention was that it contained my clothes, neatly folded. I couldn't believe my eyes. My clothes, the ones I had worn just the day before, were folded as if someone had carefully placed them in the bag. A strange chill ran down my spine. How had they gotten there? Had I packed them? Why would someone put my clothes in a bag and leave them here with me? I approached the bag cautiously, my steps slow and deliberate, trying to make sense of the situation. I reached down and picked it up. The weight of it felt familiar, but the sensation of holding it was foreign. I opened it carefully, my heart beating faster with each passing second. Inside were the clothes I recognized. My jeans, the shirt I had worn yesterday, and my jacket. Nothing seemed out of place, but the mere presence of the bag was unsettling. Why had they put my clothes here? And why was I in a room I didn't recognize? I stood there holding the bag, questions flooding my mind. How had I ended up in this room? Was I alone? Had someone brought me here? I couldn't recall how I got here, or when I had fallen asleep. The last thing I remembered was being in my own home, preparing to go to bed. But now that seemed like a distant memory. The more I thought about it, the more my head began to spin. Had I been drugged? Had I been taken against my will? There were too many possibilities, and none of them made sense. I looked around the room again, searching for any clues that might explain where I was. The furniture was minimal. A bed, a small nightstand, and a worn-out chair in the corner. The curtains were closed, blocking any view of the outside world. There was no personal touch to the room, nothing that made it feel familiar. It felt like a hotel room, but it was too bare, too impersonal to be anything but a temporary space, one that I didn't belong in. I moved toward the door, my hand resting on the cold handle. I hesitated before opening it. The fear of what I might find on the other side overwhelmed me. What if I wasn't alone in this place? What if someone had been watching me while I slept? These thoughts sent a shiver down my spine, but I knew I couldn't stay in this room forever. I had to figure out where I was. and how I had gotten here. With a deep breath, I turned the handle and opened the door slowly, peering into the hallway beyond. The hallway was quiet. The air was thick with stillness. It looked like a hallway from an old building, with faded wallpaper and dim lighting. The floors were carpeted, but the carpet was worn down in spots, like it had been walked on countless times. The walls were decorated with generic paintings, the kind that didn't stand out, just there to fill the space. The whole place felt eerie, almost sterile, and I felt a chill run through me as I stepped out into the corridor. I glanced both ways, trying to make sense of my surroundings. There was no one in sight, no sign of movement or life. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. My heart beat faster as I considered my options. Should I go left or right? Should I explore this place further or try to find an exit? The uncertainty of it all was suffocating, and the more I thought about it, the more the feeling of dread grew. I didn't know where I was, but I knew I had to leave. I took a deep breath and chose to go right. Moving cautiously down the hallway, my footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. The silence was unbearable. The weight of the unknown pressed heavily on my chest. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting someone to appear behind me. My mind raced with possibilities. Had I been kidnapped? Was this some kind of elaborate prank? Or had I been brought here for some darker purpose? As I continued down the hall, I came across a small kitchen. The door was slightly ajar. I pushed it open carefully, peeking inside. The kitchen was empty, the countertops bare except for a few utensils and a sink that hadn't been used in a while. There were no signs of life, no indication of who might have brought me here. The kitchen, like the rest of the building, felt cold and lifeless. But something about the way the space was arranged made me uneasy. It looked too sterile, too purposely set up, as if it was meant to be used, but hadn't been. I took a few steps inside, my eyes scanning the room for any signs of familiarity or clues about where I was. There was nothing, just an empty, quiet room. But then, my eyes landed on something on the counter. A small note, folded neatly, was placed next to a glass of water. My fingers trembled as I reached for it, carefully unfolding it with a sense of dread. The note was simple, just a few words written in neat, deliberate handwriting. Don't try to leave. Not yet. I froze. The words hung in the air like a warning. A cold shiver ran down my spine as I realized that whatever was happening, I wasn't in control. Someone had brought me here, and they were watching me. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach as I wondered who had left the note and why. What did it mean that I wasn't allowed to leave yet? My mind spun with questions, but no answers came. The room felt even colder now, and the note in my hand seemed to weigh heavier than anything I had ever held before. Just as I was about to take another step, a sudden noise from behind me interrupted my thoughts. I turned quickly, my heart racing in my chest, but there was no one there. The kitchen remained silent, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was close, that I wasn't alone. I looked at the note again, my grip tightening around it. I realized I was trapped in a place I didn't recognize, with no idea who had brought me here or why, and the feeling of being watched never left. Story 2. It was just a normal evening when I came home after a long day at work. The sun had set, and the sky was a soft twilight blue. I unlocked the door to my apartment and stepped inside, feeling a sense of relief. I was glad to be home. My mind was still full of thoughts about my day, so I didn't immediately notice anything strange. It wasn't until I hung up my coat and put my keys down that I saw it, a piece of paper on the floor near the door. At first, I thought it was just some junk mail that had slipped under the door, but as I bent down to pick it up, I realized it wasn't just any piece of paper. There was no return address, and no indication of who it was from. It was just a plain envelope, slightly open at the flap. Inside, there was a letter. The paper was simple, not fancy at all, but it was folded neatly in half. I hesitated for a moment. Who would leave me a letter? I wasn't expecting any deliveries or messages from anyone. I couldn't think of any reason why someone would need to contact me this way. I opened the letter, and what I saw made my heart skip a beat. The message was short but clear. The handwriting was neat, but it looked hurried. The words read, "Don't go out after dark anymore." The words felt urgent, like a warning. A chill ran down my spine. I stood there in the hallway, staring at the letter, trying to understand what it meant. Who would leave me such a message? Why would they warn me not to go out after dark? It didn't make any sense, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I turned the letter over, hoping to find more information. Maybe a signature, or a clue about who wrote it, but there was nothing. The back of the paper was blank, and the front gave no further details. I felt uneasy, like something wasn't right. Was this some kind of prank? Or was it something more serious? Something I should be worried about? My mind raced with all kinds of possibilities. Maybe it was a warning from someone who knew me, someone who had been watching me. The thought that someone might have been keeping an eye on me enough to slip a letter under my door made me feel uneasy, but there was no time to waste wondering. I needed to figure out what this meant. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something personal about this warning. It felt too direct, too real. I looked around my apartment as if expecting to find a clue that would explain the letter. The rooms were quiet, and the air felt heavy. I walked over to the window and looked outside. I half expected to see someone standing across the street, watching me from the shadows, but the street was empty. The only sounds were the faint hum of traffic and the rustling of leaves in the wind. No one was out there. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that someone or something was out there in the darkness. As the evening went on, I became more anxious. I kept glancing at the clock, watching the minutes tick by, each one bringing me closer to nightfall. I didn't want to go outside. I didn't want to take any chances, but I also didn't want to live in fear. I had no idea who had written the letter, or why. Maybe it was nothing, just some weird prank or coincidence, but what if it wasn't? What if there was something dangerous out there? Something I couldn't see. Something that was waiting for me to step outside after dark. I paced around my apartment, unsure of what to do. Should I call the police? The letter didn't seem threatening enough to warrant an investigation, but the warning felt too real to ignore. I thought about going to the building manager to ask if anyone else had received a similar letter, but I didn't want to draw attention to myself. I wasn't sure if I was being paranoid, or if there was a real reason to be concerned. My mind kept circling back to the same question. Who would leave such a cryptic message, and why me? I glanced at the clock again. It was getting late. The shadows outside were growing longer as night fell. The thought of stepping into the dark, not knowing who or what might be out there, made my skin crawl. But if I stayed inside, would I be safe? The letter kept running through my mind. Don't go out after dark anymore. Why that warning? And why now? It wasn't like I had been out late every night or had done anything to attract attention. I led a pretty normal life. I kept to myself and didn't get involved in anything dangerous. So why had someone felt the need to send me such a chilling message? Just as I was thinking this, I heard a soft knock at the door. I froze, My heart skipped a beat. Who could that be? I wasn't expecting anyone, and the letter had already put me on edge. Slowly, I moved toward the door. I looked through the peephole, but no one was there. My pulse quickened, and a wave of dread washed over me. Had someone been standing there just moments ago? Or had I imagined it? I didn't dare open the door, but the silence that followed made my skin prickle. The rest of the night felt like a blur. I tried to stay calm, but every sound outside made me jump. Every creak of the building, every rustle of leaves in the wind felt like a sign that someone was out there. Someone who had seen my letter and was waiting for me to make a move. I couldn't stop thinking about the warning. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone knew something I didn't, that I was being watched, that I was being warned for a reason. I tried to distract myself, watching TV or reading a book, anything to take my mind off the growing anxiety. But no matter what I did, I couldn't escape the feeling of unease. It was as though the letter had planted a seed of fear in my mind, and it was beginning to grow, spreading deeper into my thoughts. As the night wore on, I kept the lights on, the curtains drawn, and the door locked tight. I didn't dare go outside, not after the letter and the strange knock. I spent the rest of the evening on high alert, my senses tuned to every sound. Every once in a while, I'd peek out the window, scanning the street for any sign of movement, but there was nothing. The night passed without any incidents, but the dread lingered. It settled deep in my chest. The letter had shaken me. It made me question everything. Who had left it? And why had they chosen me? The next morning, I woke up feeling unsettled, but I was determined to move on with my day. I told myself that I had probably overreacted. It was just some weird coincidence, or maybe a prank. But as I left my apartment and stepped into the daylight, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that the warning wasn't just an idle threat. Someone out there knew something about the dark. Maybe, just maybe, they were trying to keep me safe. Or perhaps they were trying to warn me about something much worse. The letter stayed on my mind as I went about my day, and I couldn't help but wonder what was really out there in the dark, waiting for me to go outside. Should I listen to the warning, or was it already too late? Story 3. It was a typical Tuesday afternoon when the mail arrived, just like any other day. I walked to the front door to collect the usual pile, bills, flyers, and junk mail. I had gotten into the habit of sorting through the letters every day since I moved into this house years ago. As I flipped through the envelopes, one caught my eye. It was plain, with no marks or logos, except for my name written in bold letters. The return address was unfamiliar, a place I didn't recognize at all. But what caught my attention even more was the old address listed on the envelope, the one I hadn't lived at for almost 5 years. I stopped, holding the envelope in my hand, feeling a strange sense of déjà vu. The address written on the letter was the very first house I had ever lived in, back when I was much younger. I hadn't thought about that place in years, not since I moved out to attend college and eventually bought this house. It seemed odd, almost unsettling, that I was getting a letter from that old address. A rush of questions flooded my mind. Who would send me something from there? Why would they use my old address? Was this letter somehow misdirected? But as much as I tried to come up with logical explanations, a nagging feeling in my gut told me something wasn't right. I carefully opened the envelope, my fingers trembling a little. The paper inside was crinkly, as if it had been folded and kept for a while. I unfolded the letter, and as I read the words, they seemed too familiar, like something I would write myself. But I knew it wasn't my handwriting. The letters were neat, flowing, but the words made me pause. The letter was short and simple, yet the meaning behind it felt heavy. It read, "Don't go back there. It's not what you think. You've left for a reason. Trust me." The words sent a chill down my spine. Who could have written this? And why? Why would someone want to warn me? It didn't feel like a joke or prank. The tone was too serious, too personal. Whoever wrote this letter knew way too much about me, things I thought no one else knew. I stared at the return address again, trying to make sense of it. The street name was something I hadn't heard in years, but it was real. I had lived there as a child. However, the house I grew up in was long gone, replaced with new developments and houses. The place where I spent my childhood was now nothing but a distant memory. The more I thought about it, the more confused and unsettled I became. Why would someone from that area be sending me a letter now, after all this time? I sat down at the kitchen table, still holding the letter. The urge to ignore it and forget about it was strong, but something told me I couldn't. I couldn't let this go. I wasn't sure if it was my curiosity pushing me, or if there was something deeper, some strange instinct that told me I had to find out what this meant. I couldn't stop thinking about the letter. Who had sent it, and why? I tried to think of anyone who might have had a reason to send me such a cryptic letter, but I couldn't come up with anyone. I hadn't kept in touch with anyone from my old neighborhood. The friends I had there were long gone from my life. My family had moved away too, and no one had contacted me in years, especially not about the past. The more I thought about it, the more I felt like I was being pulled back into something I had left behind. But what could it be? What was there to warn me about? I had made peace with my past. I had no reason to go back, no desire to revisit my old home. So why now? Why would someone send me a letter that seemed so urgent and mysterious? I decided to investigate. I needed to know where this letter had come from and why it was addressed to me. I started by searching for the return address online, hoping it would lead to something helpful. But the more I searched, the more I realized something strange. The street name didn't seem to exist anymore. There were no businesses, no listings, no records of the place. It was like the address had vanished. Frustrated, I decided to visit the old neighborhood myself. I told myself I was just being curious, that I was overreacting. But deep down, I felt like there was more to this than a simple misdirected letter. I hadn't been back in years, but something about the letter made me feel like I had to go. I had to understand what was going on, even if it meant confronting memories I wasn't ready to face. The drive to my old neighborhood felt longer than I remembered. I took the familiar streets, but the closer I got, the more I realized how much had changed. My childhood home was gone, replaced with a sleek, modern building. The small neighborhood I remembered had grown into a sprawling complex, and everything felt different, unfamiliar. When I reached the street where my old house had been, I was shocked. The lot was empty. There was nothing there. No house, no garden, just a vacant piece of land. And I stood there, staring at the empty lot for a long time. It was as if the life I had known was erased. There was nothing left. I felt a strange emptiness inside, like a part of me had vanished with the house. The letter had warned me not to come back, but I had ignored it. I thought it was just a strange coincidence. But now, standing in front of the empty lot, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Something had drawn me back here, and I didn't know what it was. I walked around the lot, unsure of what I was looking for. The place where I had once lived didn't feel like it belonged to me anymore. It felt distant and strange, as if the world had shifted. I wandered aimlessly for a while, feeling more and more unsettled. Then something caught my eye. It was a small, weathered mailbox. I remembered it from a photo my mother had taken just before we moved away. It was the same one from my childhood home. Despite the new houses and development surrounding it, the mailbox still stood, worn but still there. I walked toward it, feeling drawn to it. As I reached out and touched it, I felt a cold rush of air. My body went dizzy, and I staggered back. Everything seemed to spin for a moment. When I looked around again, nothing appeared different. The neighborhood was still quiet, and the faint sounds of children playing could be heard in the distance. But there was something about that old mailbox. It felt like a sign, but I didn't know what it meant. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had uncovered something I wasn't supposed to find. The letter, the warning, it all felt connected to this moment. I wasn't sure what was happening, but I knew I had to keep looking for answers. There was something hidden here, something beneath the surface, and I couldn't stop until I uncovered the truth. As I stood there, staring at the old mailbox, I felt the weight of my past pressing down on me. The warning in the letter seemed clearer now. Don't go back. Don't look too closely. But it was too late. I was already here, and whatever mysteries I had left behind were starting to pull me back in. Story 4. It all started with a simple voicemail. I didn't recognize the number, and the message was filled with static, a crackling noise that was hard to understand. At first, I thought it was just a glitch, or maybe a wrong number. It seemed like nothing important. But then, the voicemails kept coming. Almost every day I would check my phone, and there would be another message. Each one was just as noisy and unclear as the last. I assumed it was some sort of prank, or maybe a problem with my phone. But then something odd happened. One evening, after hearing yet another static-filled message, I decided to listen to it more carefully. The static was still loud, but this time it seemed different. There was a slight rhythm to it, a pattern that didn't feel random. I leaned in closer to my phone, trying to hear something beneath the noise. At first, I didn't hear anything clear, but then something stood out. I felt a chill run down my spine when I realized that the noise wasn't just static. It sounded like whispers. My name was being repeated over and over again, hidden under the crackling noise. My heart started to race. I felt like someone was trying to reach me, but the message was purposely being distorted. The next time I got a voicemail, I decided to do something unusual. I flipped the recording backward, hoping to hear something more understandable. When I pressed play, the usual static filled my ears, but then I heard something that froze me in place. It was my voice, but it wasn't from a time or place I could remember. I could hear myself begging for help. The words were clear and desperate, as though I was pleading for someone to save me from something terrible. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I felt sick to my stomach. It was my voice, but it didn't sound like me. The tone, the urgency, it was all wrong. I didn't recognize the voice, even though it was mine. I couldn't understand how this was possible. I hadn't recorded anything like that. I had never been in any kind of danger. I hadn't needed help. But there I was, hearing myself, frightened and terrified. I tried to ignore it, but the unease kept growing. I tried calling the number back, but no one answered. The voicemail box was empty. Each new message was the same. More static, more whispers, and my voice begging for help. The messages started coming more often, and they seemed more urgent. In one recording, I could almost hear heavy breathing, as if someone was close to me, watching me. Another time, I heard faint footsteps, like someone was walking around me, circling me. I began to feel like I was being watched. Every time I entered a room, I felt a sense of dread, like someone had been there before me. My phone was always in my hand, waiting for the next message. But with every voicemail, I felt more and more afraid. Why was this happening? Why was someone sending these messages? And how did they have my voice? My exact words? It felt like I was trapped in a nightmare, unable to escape. I tried to talk to a friend about it. I played the voicemail for them, hoping they would understand. But when they listened, they didn't hear anything strange. To them, it was just static. They couldn't hear the whispers or my voice pleading for help. I felt completely alone. The more I listened to the messages, the more confused I became. How could my voice be in those recordings when I hadn't made them? It wasn't just a prank. This was something darker. One night, I woke up in a cold sweat. My heart was pounding. It felt like I had heard the voicemail in my dreams, my voice calling out in desperation. I grabbed my phone and checked it immediately, hoping it was all just a bad dream. But there was a new message waiting for me. I hesitated, my hands trembling. I pressed play. The usual static filled the air, and for a brief moment, I thought I heard my name whispered through the noise. But when I played it backward, I froze in shock. This time, it wasn't just my voice. It was a chorus of voices. Many versions of me, all pleading for help, all trapped in the same desperate cry. The voices were layered on top of each other, overlapping, creating a horrible sound of distress that sent a wave of terror through me. I couldn't understand it. My phone wasn't just malfunctioning, it was like something, or someone, was reaching out to me through it. The voices were too clear, too real. The fact that they seemed trapped in the static made it feel even more impossible. Was I hearing myself from some other time? From a different version of me? Or was I hearing my future self calling for help? The thought seemed ridiculous, but the evidence was right there in front of me. As the days went on, the messages became more cryptic. The static grew louder. The whispers became more frantic. And always, my voice, pleading for help, echoed through the recordings. Each new message carried more urgency, like time was running out. The voices seemed to be warning me, trying to get me to understand something, but I couldn't make sense of it. One afternoon, as I was going through the messages again, I heard something that made my blood run cold. Beneath the static and my voice, I heard a new sound. It was faint at first, but unmistakable. A door creaking open, followed by slow, deliberate footsteps. My breath caught in my throat as I realized that the footsteps weren't just in the recording. They were happening now, in my house. I spun around, expecting to see someone behind me, but the room was empty. The footsteps kept echoing in my mind, growing louder even though no one was there. The messages had escalated to something I couldn't ignore anymore. They weren't just strange or unsettling. They were warnings. Warnings from myself, or from some other version of me. Or maybe they were from something else. Something trying to reach me through these distorted recordings. I knew now that the static wasn't random. It was deliberate. The message had been hidden within the noise, waiting for me to hear it, waiting for me to understand. But I still didn't know who was behind the messages or why they were happening. I felt like I was being pulled into something I didn't understand, something much darker than I had ever imagined. My voice calling for help, over and over again, was a constant reminder that something was wrong. And no matter how many times I listened to the recordings, no matter how many times I tried to figure out what they meant, the only thing I knew for sure was that I couldn't escape it. Someone or something was trying to tell me something, and I had no idea what would happen if I didn't listen. Story 5. At first, I thought it was just a coincidence. My neighbor, Mr. Thompson, always parked his old, reliable sedan in the same spot across the street. It wasn't anything special, just a regular car, but I had gotten used to seeing it there. Every morning when I left for work, it was parked outside his house. Every evening when I came home, it was still there, sitting in its usual spot. It was a part of my routine, so much so that I didn't really think twice about it. But recently, something didn't feel right. I hadn't seen Mr. Thompson in weeks. I wasn't close to him, but we would exchange polite hellos when we saw each other outside. He was a quiet man who lived alone, kept to himself, and had been that way since I moved into the neighborhood about a year ago. It wasn't strange for someone to be a bit reclusive, but as the days passed and I never saw him coming or going, I started to wonder where he had gone. His car was still there, parked in the same spot every day, but there were no signs of him. There were no deliveries, no visitors, and no sounds of his TV blaring through the walls. It was like he had disappeared completely. At first I brushed it off. Maybe he had gone on vacation, or maybe he was sick and stuck inside. I even told myself that maybe he was away on a long business trip. But as the days stretched into 2 weeks, then 3, I began to feel uneasy. The car never moved. I would check my watch and see the same sedan parked exactly where it had been the day before. At this point, it had become a daily habit to check on it whenever I walked out of my house. I started to feel like something was wrong, but I couldn't explain why. I decided to ask a few of the other neighbors if they had seen Mr. Thompson recently. Everyone seemed just as confused as I was. No one had seen him in weeks either. Mrs. Harris, who lived 2 doors down from him, said she hadn't seen him take out his trash or come out to get his mail. She also mentioned that she hadn't heard his car start in what felt like forever. That's when I began to wonder, was the car even his anymore? Was it possible that someone else had been using it? Maybe even without his knowledge? After a few more days passed with no sign of Mr. Thompson, I decided to go over to his house. The idea made me nervous, but something deep inside pushed me to do it. I walked across the street, hesitating for a moment before I reached his front door and knocked. I knocked again, louder this time, but there was no answer. I couldn't hear anything from inside the house. No footsteps, no conversations, nothing. I rang the doorbell and waited, but still, there was no answer. For a brief moment, I rested my hand on the doorknob and thought about turning it, just to see if the door was unlocked, but I immediately pulled my hand back, feeling like I was crossing some invisible line. I stood there for a few more seconds, unsure of what to do next. I had a deep sense of unease, like I was intruding on something that wasn't meant to be disturbed. Finally, I left, but my mind was full of questions. Why wasn't Mr. Thompson home? If he had gone away, why didn't anyone know where he was? And why was his car still parked in the same spot every day, untouched? The next day, I decided to try something else. I would watch the house all day, hoping to catch some clue that would explain what was going on. By early afternoon, I noticed something strange. A faint shadow passed by the window of Mr. Thompson's front room. I couldn't be sure, but it looked like someone had moved inside. My heart skipped a beat, and I quickly grabbed my phone. But by the time I looked back up, the shadow was gone. I wasn't sure if I had imagined it or if it was real, but the feeling that something was wrong grew even stronger. After that, I couldn't stop thinking about the car. Each day, it sat there across the street. Its engine never turned on. The owner was nowhere to be found. What made things even stranger was that the car was never locked. Whenever I walked by, the driver's side door was always open, or the window was slightly rolled down. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. It was like the car was part of some strange, unspoken game, but no one else seemed concerned. No one even mentioned it. I tried talking to a couple of neighbors about it again, but they just shrugged and said that Mr. Thompson probably had his reasons for keeping to himself. No one seemed as unsettled as I was. A week later, I couldn't resist the urge to look inside the car. The front door was slightly ajar again, just like it had been before, and the key was still in the ignition, as though someone had parked it and forgotten about it. I approached cautiously, unsure of what I was looking for, or what I expected to find. I peered through the window, but I saw nothing out of the ordinary. Just worn leather seats and a small pile of papers on the passenger side. But as I stepped back to leave, something caught my eye in the back seat. There was a small duffel bag I hadn't noticed before. It seemed strange, considering that Mr. Thompson didn't usually have visitors or stay overnight anywhere. The bag was zipped up tightly, but a small part of it was slightly open. I felt a sudden, inexplicable urge to look inside. I reached for the handle of the back door, hesitating at first. But then, my curiosity got the best of me. The door creaked open, and I peered inside the bag. What I found inside shocked me. A pile of folded clothes, a few toiletries, and strangely, some photos. The photos were of Mr. Thompson, but there was something off about them. They weren't candid shots or personal pictures. They were staged, like someone had taken them on purpose. They were all from different angles, showing him standing alone in various places, as if he were being watched. I shuddered as I closed the bag and quickly stepped away from the car. My mind was racing. The unease I had felt for weeks grew stronger after that. The photos haunted me, and I couldn't stop thinking about them. Why had Mr. Thompson kept those pictures in his car? And why hadn't anyone seen him in so long? It was like he had just vanished, leaving only his car behind. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that something wasn't right. The car wasn't just a vehicle. It was a symbol of something. Something that shouldn't have been there. It had become an eerie reminder of the mystery surrounding my neighbor's sudden disappearance. At this point, I wasn't sure what I was supposed to do. I had no evidence, no answers, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had happened to Mr. Thompson and that the car was somehow tied to it. I watched it every day, waiting for something, anything, to change. But the car remained parked in the same spot, a constant presence that seemed to grow more unsettling with each passing day. I don't know what happened to Mr. Thompson, but I've come to realize that the car was never meant to be just a car. It was the clue, the missing piece of the puzzle that was always there, and yet it never gave up its secrets. Story 6. It was late in the afternoon when I first noticed the package. I had been relaxing on the couch, scrolling through my phone, when I heard a faint knock on the door. I wasn't expecting anything, so at first I thought it might be a mistake or a delivery for a neighbor. But when I opened the door, I found a small, unmarked box sitting on the front step. There was no return address, no label, just a plain, brown, cardboard package. My heart skipped a beat. I had no idea what to make of it. I hadn't ordered anything recently, and the thought of receiving a mysterious package made me feel uneasy. I stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do. Should I open it? Should I call someone? It was probably a harmless mistake, but the fact that there was no identifying information on the box made it feel wrong. Curiosity got the better of me. I bent down, picked up the package, and brought it inside. My hands trembled slightly as I sliced open the tape. The anticipation felt suffocating, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was about to uncover something I wasn't meant to see. When I finally opened the box, I found just one item inside. It was a photo. My stomach churned as I stared at the picture. It was a photo of me standing on my front porch, taken from a distance. I recognized the moment right away. It had been the day before, when I had stepped outside to grab the mail. I was standing there holding an envelope in my hand, completely unaware that someone had been watching me. The picture had been taken through the window, and the angle made it clear that the person who took it had been standing across the street. I hadn't noticed anyone at the time, but now I realized that someone had been watching me, possibly for days. I felt a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck as I turned the photo over, half expecting to see some sort of note or message written on the back. But there was nothing. No words, no explanation. Just that single, haunting image of me, unsuspecting and caught in a moment I had thought was private. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. Who could have taken this picture? Who had sent it to me, and why? I glanced out the window, half expecting to see someone standing across the street, watching my every move. But the street was empty, as it always was, in the quiet neighborhood. I quickly closed the blinds, my thoughts spiraling. The fact that someone had been that close to my house without me noticing was unsettling. The photo was a clear reminder that someone knew where I lived, knew what I looked like, and had been paying attention to me in ways I hadn't even realized. My first instinct was to call the police, but what would I tell them? That I had received an anonymous package with a picture of myself in it. It seemed so absurd, so out of place, that I wasn't sure they would take me seriously. Still, I couldn't just ignore it. I needed to report it, if only to make sure that someone knew what was happening. But even as I pulled out my phone and started dialing, I hesitated. What if this was just the beginning? What if the person who had sent the picture had more plans, more messages, more surprises for me? I put the photo back in the box and placed it on the kitchen counter. My hands were shaking, and my heart wouldn't stop pounding. I kept replaying the moment in my mind, the picture frozen in my memory. Who could have been so close to my home, watching me? The whole situation felt like a bad dream, something that didn't make sense, yet felt so real. I knew I couldn't let it go, but at the same time, I didn't know what to do next. Should I start looking over my shoulder, expecting something else to show up? Was this just a prank, or was there something more sinister behind it? I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. The rational part of my brain told me to stay calm, to think logically. Maybe it was just a coincidence, a harmless mistake. Maybe someone had snapped the picture without meaning anything by it, and the package was simply an error, a mix-up in the delivery system. But that voice in my head kept getting drowned out by fear. Fear that this was deliberate. Fear that whoever had done this knew more than they should. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every sound seemed louder than usual. Every creak of the floorboards felt like someone was moving just outside my door. I checked the locks on all the windows and doors, making sure everything was secure. I even pulled the blinds down tighter, although I wasn't sure that would stop someone from watching me. The whole house felt different now, more like a cage, a place where I was being observed. I spent the night looking out the windows, scanning the street for any signs of movement. But there was nothing. The street remained as quiet as always, with only the distant hum of traffic in the background. Yet the unease didn't leave me. It was as though someone was just waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves. Maybe they were already inside my head, twisting my thoughts, making me paranoid, making me question every shadow. The next morning, I went outside to take a closer look at my front porch, hoping to find something that could explain the photo. But there was nothing. No footprints. No signs of anyone having been there recently. I walked down the street, trying to see if I could spot anyone who might have been lurking around, but again, the neighborhood was empty. Everyone seemed to be going about their daily routines without a care in the world. I couldn't shake the feeling that the picture was a warning, that whoever had taken it was letting me know they were watching. They had sent me the message, but I had no idea what the next step would be. I couldn't help but feel like this was just the first of many signs. I tried to tell myself it was nothing to worry about, that it was just some random coincidence. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. Later that week, another package arrived. This time, there was no photo inside, just a single sentence written in the same neat handwriting as the first note. I'm still watching. It was like a chilling confirmation of what I had feared. Whoever had been watching me wasn't going to stop. They were out there somewhere, observing me from the shadows, and I had no way of knowing when they would strike next. I had no choice but to live with the fear of knowing that someone was always watching me, always one step ahead. And that thought, more than anything, left me feeling completely helpless. Story 7. It was just another normal evening when I decided to check the security footage from my apartment. For some reason, I had been feeling uneasy for a while. I couldn't quite explain why, but there was a strange feeling of paranoia following me around. Little things had started to feel off, like when items were misplaced, lights left on when I was sure I had turned them off, and the overwhelming sense that someone was watching me. I couldn't shake the feeling, so I decided to finally check the security footage. I thought it might help ease my mind. I accessed the footage from the camera that was installed near the entrance of my apartment, expecting to find nothing more than some deliveries or the occasional visitor. But as I scrubbed through the footage, I noticed something that immediately made my heart race. The timestamp on the footage showed that it was from a day when I had been out running errands. I watched as the door to my apartment opened with no key in hand, and someone stepped inside. I froze. My stomach sank. I had been gone all day, and the door had been locked when I left. How could someone have gotten in? The footage was grainy, but I could make out the silhouette of the person. Someone I didn't recognize. They moved with a strange sense of familiarity, as if they knew the layout of my apartment. They didn't seem to be in a hurry at all, as if they weren't worried about being caught. I sat in stunned silence as they walked through the front door, paused briefly in the hallway, and then moved deeper into my apartment. They spent a few minutes in the living room, then entered my bedroom. I couldn't make out much more because of the poor quality of the footage, but just the idea that someone had been inside my private space, going through my things, made my blood run cold. I replayed the footage over and over, hoping I was missing something. I wanted to catch a glimpse of their face, but the person's features were too obscured. Their body was cloaked in shadows, and they moved quickly enough that I couldn't tell whether they were male or female, young or old. They weren't wearing anything distinctive that could have helped me figure out who they were. One thing was certain. Someone had been inside my apartment without my knowledge. I immediately went to check my apartment. My mind was racing with questions, and my heart was pounding in my chest. I opened the door and stepped inside. Everything seemed normal at first glance, but as I walked through the apartment, I noticed a few things that didn't feel quite right. My bathroom cabinet was slightly ajar, and there was a small stack of papers on my desk that hadn't been there before. I checked the rest of the apartment, but nothing else seemed disturbed. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there. Someone who had known exactly what they were doing. I checked the footage again, desperately trying to find a clue that would help me figure out who the intruder was. There was no sign of a struggle, no evidence of forced entry, just the person calmly walking through my apartment, as if they had every right to be there. The thought that someone had been in my home, rifling through my belongings without my permission, made me feel violated. I felt unsafe, exposed, but I couldn't figure out how they had gained access or what they had been looking for. My mind raced as I tried to piece together any information that could explain what had happened. Had I forgotten to lock the door one day, or had someone copied my keys? I hadn't noticed anything unusual when I returned home, but that didn't mean much. What if they were still out there watching, waiting for the right moment to strike again? I had no idea who this person was, or what they were looking for, but the idea that they were so comfortable in my space made me feel helpless. I didn't know who to turn to. The building manager was hardly ever around, and I couldn't rely on my neighbors. They were rarely home, and I didn't want to alarm them unnecessarily. Besides, who would believe me? The footage was disturbing, but it wasn't solid proof of anything criminal. It was just a person entering my apartment without permission, something that could have been explained away if I didn't know better. I reached out to a friend for advice, telling them what I had seen. They were concerned but unsure what steps to take. They suggested I call the police, but the idea of involving them seemed extreme. There was no clear evidence that anything had been stolen or damaged, and I didn't want to jump to conclusions. Still, the feeling of being watched lingered, and every night, when I went to bed, I couldn't shake the thought that the intruder might return. After a few days, I decided to set up a few additional cameras, hoping to catch any further activity. I installed one inside my bedroom, right above the doorway, and another in the kitchen. It felt a bit invasive, but I wasn't going to take any chances. I wasn't going to let someone walk through my life uninvited again, not without knowing who they were. I hoped that if they returned, I would finally get a glimpse of their face or some detail that would reveal their identity. The next few days passed without incident, but I kept reviewing the footage obsessively. I felt like a prisoner in my own home, constantly on edge, never fully at ease. Then, just as I had started to think that maybe it was all a fluke, the footage revealed something chilling. The same person entered my apartment again, but this time, they weren't alone. There was another figure with them, someone I couldn't see clearly, but just the way they moved, their shadowy presence sent a wave of terror through me. I couldn't understand what was going on, but it was clear that this was no coincidence. I didn't know who these people were, or why they were coming into my apartment, but one thing was certain. They knew more about me than I knew about them. I had no idea if I was being targeted, or if something far more sinister was at play. All I could feel was the weight of the unknown, the uncertainty of who was entering my private space when I wasn't there. I had to act quickly. I contacted the building management and requested that they change the locks and review the security footage from the building's main entrance. But despite my best efforts, the question remained. Who were these people, and why had they chosen to enter my apartment in the first place? I had no answers, only the unsettling thought that they knew more about me than I knew about them. And that thought haunted me every moment I spent in my apartment, wondering if someone was still out there, watching me. Story 8. I woke up suddenly, my heart pounding in my chest. The room was dark, with only the faint light of the moon shining through the curtains. I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had been growing all night. It was like I was being watched, but I couldn't explain why. I rubbed my eyes, trying to shake off the fog of sleep. As my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I noticed something strange. There, on my pillow, was a small folded piece of paper. I didn't remember putting anything there before I went to sleep. My mind raced with questions as I reached for the note, my fingers trembling slightly. I unfolded it carefully, not wanting to tear the fragile paper. The handwriting was neat and precise, but there was something unsettling about it. It didn't look like anyone I knew had written it. The words on the note were simple, but they sent a chill down my spine. We've been watching you, and now it's your turn. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment, I felt paralyzed with fear. Who could have left this note? How had they gotten into my room without me hearing anything? There was no sign of forced entry, and everything seemed normal, except for the note. The words kept echoing in my mind, repeating over and over. Now, it's your turn. What did it mean? What was happening? I quickly scanned the room, looking for any signs that someone had been there, but nothing seemed out of place. The window was shut, the door was locked, and nothing in my apartment had been disturbed. Yet, the feeling of being watched lingered, almost as if the note itself had a presence in the room with me. I couldn't shake the thought that someone was out there, waiting for me to do something. My mind raced, trying to think of any possible explanation. Could it be a prank? A sick joke someone had played on me? But who would do something like this? I didn't have any enemies, and no one in my life seemed the type to pull something so disturbing. The more I thought about it, the less sense it made. I had no reason to believe anyone would want to hurt me or scare me like this. But the note seemed so deliberate, so carefully placed, as if it had been left there with a purpose. I sat up in bed, still holding the note in my hand, trying to decide what to do next. Should I call the police? Should I tell someone? But what could I say? How could I explain that someone had left a note on my pillow, claiming they'd been watching me? The idea of involving the authorities seemed absurd. There was no evidence of a crime, no clear threat. Still, I couldn't ignore the dread gnawing at my stomach, telling me that something was wrong. Something had changed. I decided to leave the note where it was, refusing to let it control me, but I couldn't shake the anxiety creeping over me. I got out of bed and went to the kitchen, trying to distract myself. I poured a glass of water, my hand shaking slightly. As I took a sip, my mind kept racing, analyzing every detail, every possible explanation. But no matter how many times I retraced my steps, I kept coming back to the same question. Who had been watching me, and why? It was too personal to be a random act. Someone had been watching me, observing my every move, and now they were telling me it was my turn. I tried to go back to sleep, but every creak of the floorboard, every rustling of the wind outside made me jump. I couldn't get comfortable. I couldn't quiet the unease bubbling inside me. Every shadow in the room seemed to hold a hidden presence. Every flicker of light seemed like a warning. When I closed my eyes, I imagined someone standing at the foot of my bed, silently watching me sleep. The thought made my skin crawl, and I pulled the covers tighter around me, as if they could protect me from whatever was out there. The next morning, the note was still on my pillow, sitting there like a reminder of the previous night's terror. I hesitated for a moment before picking it up again. This time, I was more careful. Maybe I had missed something, but there was nothing new. No more words. It was just those same chilling words. We've been watching you, and now it's your turn. I tried to tell myself it was nothing. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe I had been too tired, and my mind had run wild. But the sense of dread that hung in the air wouldn't let me forget it. I spent the day looking over my shoulder, watching the shadows, listening for sounds that might suggest someone was following me. I went about my usual routine, work, errands, visiting friends, but I couldn't shake the feeling of paranoia. Every time I turned a corner or walked down a quiet street, I couldn't help but wonder if someone was behind me, watching, waiting. It was exhausting, trying to act normal while the knowing fear crawled beneath my skin. As the days passed, the note became a constant presence in my mind. I couldn't stop thinking about it, wondering if someone was planning something. Was this just the beginning of something bigger? I started double-checking the locks on my doors and windows, even though I had never felt the need to do so before. I found myself scanning my surroundings more carefully, looking for any signs that someone might be watching me. But there were no clues, no hints that anything was wrong, other than the note. Then one evening, I came home to find that the note was gone. It wasn't on my pillow anymore, and it wasn't anywhere in my apartment. I tore through the house, checking every drawer, every surface, but it was as if the note had vanished into thin air. Panic rose in my chest. Was it all just a dream? Had I imagined it? But I knew I hadn't. The memory of the note, the feeling of its weight in my hand, was too vivid to be a figment of my imagination. I couldn't help but wonder if whoever had been watching me was still out there, waiting for me to make the next move. What did they want? What was their game? The fear had become all-consuming, and I felt as though I was being pulled into something darker, something I couldn't escape. I had to find out who was behind this, but I had no idea where to start. All I knew for sure was that the note had been a warning. Whatever was coming next, it was my turn to face it. Story 9. It started off so simply, just a random text from an unknown number. At first, I didn't think much of it. The message was short, just a few words. You're at the coffee shop on Elm Street, sipping your usual. I had no idea how the sender knew that, but I figured it might have been a coincidence. After all, Elm Street was a popular area. Many people could have seen me sitting there, but then it happened again. The next day, I received another message. You're in the grocery store, looking at the cereal aisle. I hadn't told anyone I was going to the store, and there was no way for the sender to know what I was doing. The texts weren't just about where I was, but what I was doing, what I was looking at, and even what I was wearing. The third message was even more unsettling. It said, you just picked up a blue sweater from the rack at the clothing store downtown. I hadn't bought the sweater, and I hadn't mentioned it to anyone, not even my closest friends. My heart started to race as I realized someone was watching me. Whoever was sending these messages seemed to know everything about my movements, even the smallest details. I tried to tell myself that there must be a reasonable explanation. Maybe someone had seen me and was just guessing where I was. Maybe I was being followed without realizing it. But the more the text kept coming, the more impossible that seemed. Soon, the messages became even more unsettling. The sender started predicting my actions, texting me before I even made a decision. One message said, you're about to leave your apartment. I checked the time. It was 9:45 a.m. I had been planning to leave soon. Then a few minutes later, another text came. You're locking your door now. I had no idea how the sender knew. It wasn't just about the places I went anymore. They seemed to know my every move, my every thought. I began to feel like I was always being watched, like someone was shadowing me, observing everything I did. But no matter how much I tried to convince myself otherwise, I couldn't shake the growing sense of dread that took over me. The most chilling message came one night when I was sitting at home. I had just finished dinner and was scrolling through my phone when my phone buzzed again. The text read, you're sitting on your couch, staring at the TV, but you're not really watching it. You're thinking about how to make this stop. I froze. I hadn't told anyone that I was thinking about calling the police or telling someone about the strange messages. No one could have known what I was thinking, except the person sending these texts. I tried calling the number back, hoping to confront whoever was behind this, but the calls wouldn't go through. The number was always disconnected. It made no sense. How could someone be so close to me, so in tune with my life, without my knowledge? I started to feel like I was living in a nightmare, where I was being stalked by someone invisible. They knew where I was, what I was doing, and what I was thinking, and I couldn't stop them. I started taking extra precautions. I stopped going to the places I usually went to, hoping that would throw the sender off. I tried to change my routine, to make my movements unpredictable, but the texts kept coming. One night, I received a message that said, "You're lying in bed now, staring at the ceiling, thinking about what you should do next." My heart raced as I realized the sender had become even more aware of my private moments. The message felt like an invasion, as if someone had stepped into my mind, reading my thoughts as easily as if they were written on a page. I couldn't escape them. There was no place I could go to hide. Every time I tried to ignore the texts, they seemed to get worse. The sender seemed to sense my fear and fed off it. The messages became more personal and more intrusive. One message came while I was sitting in my car, parked at a red light. "You're driving to the park now, feeling nervous. You're wondering if you should just stay home." I looked around the parking lot, half expecting to see someone watching me from a distance, but the area was empty. Still, I felt like I was being suffocated by an invisible grip that had taken hold of my life. The turning point came one evening when I received a text that made my blood run cold. It said, "I know your name. I know where you live. I know everything about you." A cold shiver ran down my spine. Whoever this person was, they weren't just observing me anymore. They were threatening me. My mind raced as I tried to figure out who could be behind this. Could it be someone from my past? Someone I had wronged? Or was it a complete stranger who had somehow managed to infiltrate my life? The thought that anyone, anywhere, could be watching me with such precision terrified me. I contacted the authorities, but they were as confused as I was. They told me to block the number and report any further messages. But blocking the number didn't stop the texts. They kept coming, each one more intrusive than the last. One message read, "You're sitting in your living room now, trying to figure out who I am, but you won't ever figure it out." I felt like I was being trapped in a twisted game where the rules kept changing, and I could never win. Every time I tried to break free, the sender would find a new way to worm their way back into my life. The last text I received made my heart stop. It said, "I'm right outside your door." I rushed to my window and looked outside, but there was no one there. The area was empty. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there, waiting for me to make a move. I felt like I was living in a constant state of fear. I never knew when the next message would come or who was behind it all. I couldn't escape the feeling that my privacy had been completely shattered, that I was no longer in control of my own life. I didn't know if I would ever get answers, but I knew one thing for certain. I was being watched. Story 10. It was supposed to be a relaxing weekend getaway. I had booked an Airbnb in a small town just outside the city, hoping for some quiet time away from the busy, noisy world. The house was charming, tucked on a peaceful street, and I spent my weekend exploring the nearby woods, taking long walks, and enjoying calm nights. By the time Sunday came around, I felt refreshed and ready to head home. But little did I know, something was waiting for me at the house that would make me question everything I thought I knew. I arrived back at the house in the late afternoon, pulling my suitcase behind me. The sun was still shining, and a light breeze was blowing, rustling the leaves in the trees. I took my keys from my bag, ready to unlock the door and settle back into my own space. But as I inserted the key into the lock, something felt strange. It wasn't the usual resistance of a locked door. No, this time, The key slid in too easily, as if the lock had already been turned. My heart skipped a beat. I twisted the key and slowly pushed the door open, my eyes scanning the hallway. The house was eerily quiet, and nothing seemed out of place at first. The air smelled the same, musty but clean, as if someone had aired it out during the weekend. But then I froze. There it was, something small but undeniable. The key was still in the lock, exactly where I left it when I locked the door behind me before leaving for the trip. The door had been closed when I arrived, but the key was still in the lock, as if someone had entered after I left. I stood there, staring at the door, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. My first thought was that maybe I had forgotten to lock the door when I left, but I quickly dismissed it. I was sure I had locked it. I distinctly remembered checking the lock before I stepped out the door, making sure everything was secure. It was impossible that I had simply left it unlocked. But if I didn't leave it unlocked, then who had been inside? And why hadn't I noticed anything different when I first arrived? I stepped inside cautiously, my heart racing. I could feel the anxiety rising in my chest as my mind raced even faster. Everything seemed to be in order. The furniture, the decorations, the little touches the host had left for me, all remained exactly as they had been. But there was something off, something I couldn't put my finger on. The silence felt heavy, more oppressive than before. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I walked through the house, checking each room, but no one was there. The air in the living room felt slightly cooler, like a window had been opened and closed again, but all the windows were shut. Nothing seemed unusual, but still, the feeling of unease remained. I checked the bathroom, the kitchen, and even the closets. Everything was empty, just as I had left it. It wasn't until I reached the bedroom that I noticed something strange. The bed was made, but not in the way I had left it. The pillow was slightly askew, and the blanket was pulled tighter than I usually did. It was such a small thing, a tiny detail, but it felt like a glaring sign that something was wrong. I was certain that when I had left, the bed had been in a more casual state, with the blankets tossed carelessly to one side, just as I liked it. My pulse quickened. Could it be that someone had been inside after all? I had rented the place for the weekend, and the host had assured me no one else would be there. But if the key had been left in the lock, if the bed had been rearranged, it was as though someone had been here, someone who wasn't supposed to be. I wasn't sure whether to call the host or contact the authorities. I wondered if they would believe me. Should I even tell them? What if I was just overthinking it? It was possible that the host had someone come in to clean while I was away, though that didn't explain the key still being in the lock. I stood in the middle of the room, debating what to do next. I tried to shake off the eerie feeling that had settled over me, telling myself that I was just being paranoid. Still, the thought kept nagging at me. Something had happened while I was away. The house felt different, almost like it had been touched by someone who had no business being there. But who and why? I pulled my phone from my pocket, ready to call the host. But before I could dial, something caught my eye. In the corner of the room, there was a small folded piece of paper sitting on the dresser, as if it had been left there for me to find. I hesitated for a moment, staring at the note. It wasn't from the host. That much I was sure of. My fingers trembled slightly as I picked it up and unfolded it. The handwriting was neat, but unfamiliar. It read, "I know you're back. I've been waiting for you." My stomach dropped, and a cold wave of fear washed over me. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of the message. Had the host left it there as a joke, or had someone else been inside watching me? I couldn't bring myself to answer either question. Panic began to rise in my chest. I immediately texted the host, explaining the situation, and asking if anyone had been inside the house while I was gone. I didn't wait for a response. I couldn't. Instead, I grabbed my things, ready to leave. I wanted nothing more than to get out of that house and away from whatever had just happened. As I was about to head out the door, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, hoping for reassurance from the host. But what I read only deepened my feeling of dread. The message from the host was simple. "I haven't been there. Are you sure everything is okay?" I paused, standing in the hallway. My heart pounded. I was certain I had been alone when I left, but now nothing seemed certain. The house, the key, the note, all of it was confusing. It was as though someone had been in my space, waiting for me, and I had no idea who or why. I quickly packed up the last of my things and walked out of the house, locking the door behind me. My hand shook as I turned the key. On the way home, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still watching me, waiting for me to come back. I never stayed in that Airbnb again. The experience stayed with me. I couldn't forget the feeling of being watched, of someone else having been inside the house when I wasn't there. The memory of the key in the lock and the note on the dresser haunted me, long after I left that town. But no matter how hard I tried, I could never figure out who had been waiting for me.